Hello Reddit. In this video I'd like to go over a few editing techniques in After Effects, and these don't necessarily just apply to upvote and downvote GIFs. This could be to any creation that you'd like to make. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing I'd like to go over is masking. Masking is a very powerful tool that will allow us to put our objects in different areas on the screen. That way they seem more realistic to their environments. And you'll see what I mean in a minute here. Okay, so the clip we're going to be using for the example here is this little sword fight here from Dumb and Dumber. So I'm going to go ahead and put a downvote on top of his top hat here since he's blue. And we'll see why masking is important in this instance. So I'm going to go ahead and scrub to about right here. Okay. Let's bring in our downvote. Adjust the size. Okay, that's good. Let's just get a little bit of rotation. I'm not going to worry about specifics too much here. And let's start keyframing the position. Okay, that should be good enough. So what this is basically doing is you can see the arrow is going to follow his hat here. Now this looks fine and all, but obviously you can see the pretty glaring issue is that this arrow is going through the doorway. Now he's going behind the doorway, but we obviously can't just put the arrow behind the doorway because this is a compiled video that we're editing on top of here. So this is where masking comes into play. Masking will allow us to hide the arrow in the appropriate position. That way it kind of gives a depth to the object that we're adding in here. Okay, now there's a couple ways to do this, two in fact, at least that I work with, and it really depends on your situation. And that situation is the thing that's being masked, if it's traveling through an object that is static or not. In this case, this doorway is static. You can see that there's very slight camera movement on the doorway. It's pretty static. In some cases, such as perhaps if you look at his elbow here and her head, both of them are moving. So I wouldn't necessarily call that static per se. But in this case, this door frame is pretty still. So we're going to look at the first way to do the editing. So we want to come down here into our editing area. We're going to add a new solid. Okay, it'll just be the whole screen size. Alright, now when I have this black solid selected, I'm going to hit Control-Shift-N, and that's going to give me a mask. Okay, and you're going to see this yellow box here, and this represents your mask. Now the way this works is we're basically doing a masking object. So this black solid is our masking object. And this needs to be one layer above the object that we want to mask. In this case we want to mask the downvote arrow. Okay, so I've created the mask. You can see I've got this outline. Okay, I can grab these corners and move it around. You'll see how it starts showing the back scene here. Now in order to apply this masking object to the previous layer here, I'm going to come over here to the track matte column, and I'm going to choose alpha matte, and it's going to give me the name for the layer above it, which in this case is masking object. So we'll choose that. Now you can see we can see the entire scene because now this object, this layer, has been turned into a track matte, which is why these icons have changed. So any type of masking that we do on this layer is going to be applied to the layer beneath it, and we'll see in a second here what we're going to do with this. So in order to adjust the masking, we've got these little points here on our corners. So currently I can just click on one and drag it around, and this will basically change my masking area. Now you can see that if I clicked one, I'm only dragging one at a time here. There's a few little keyboard shortcuts here. So when I've clicked on it, you can see it's become solid. You can see these other ones are not solid anymore. That means they are not selected. If I hold Alt and hit one of these corners, you'll see all of them are selected. Now I can move the entire object. Okay. If I want to get back to singular, I can just hold Shift, click on one of these, and you can see I've deselected it, and now I can click on it again and it'll be by itself. So what I want to do is I want to get this masking area to fit into the door frame here. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of quickly move these over into place. Okay. And you can see it's starting to remove that arrow because this is the masking area. And the way the settings are set currently is that it will only draw the arrow within the masking object. So let's go ahead and get this set up in the door frame. About right there, and we'll put him here, and then this doesn't really matter. Okay, so this mask object, you can see it intersects with the entire door frame here. Now the problem currently is that this mask object is set to add, which means that it's going to only add the object that it's masking within its current context. We want to actually switch this over to subtract. Okay, so in your masking object under the mask that we just put down, go ahead and select subtract. Now what this means is anywhere that the arrow object passes through the mask, it's going to subtract it. So in the case of this, as he moves through it, you can see that the arrow is being hidden within the masking area. So when we play the video back now suddenly we're getting this illusion that the arrow is behind the door along with him, and this looks much more realistic to this video. See, masking is pretty simple in most circumstances. It gets rather difficult when you've got moving objects that are interacting with each other and you have to keep adjusting your mask. In this case, like I said, the video has a pretty static doorway. You can see this doorway really doesn't change at all. The camera doesn't move a whole lot. If I wanted to do masking for just the arrow object, so let's go ahead and get rid of this mask. Okay. I can do the same thing, Control-Shift-N. That'll give me my masking object here. You see I can move around different areas and it'll show what I want to show. So I'm going to go ahead and just make this a vertical piece here. Just kind of make this a bounding box type thing. Okay. And we're going to switch this guy over back to subtract. Okay. Now you're instantly going to see what the problem is here. So right now I've got this lined up, right? So as the arrow approaches the doorway, it's going to get it hidden behind it. The problem though now is that this mask is on the same position coordinates as the arrow. So as the arrow moves, lo and behold, the mask moves, which we don't want because remember our hiding area is static. So what I can do, and of course in this instance you wouldn't want to do it this way, you'd want to do it with the masking layer, but this doesn't always work, so sometimes you have to do it this way. We're going to go ahead and keyframe on mask path, which is actually the location of our little shape here. Okay, so move that one frame, and then we can go ahead and move this guy back over, move one frame, move him back over, and we can keep doing that. Okay, so now you can see it goes behind the door, and as we move our masking layer, it's going to continue to hide the arrow depending on where we've moved it. Okay, and like I said, this is the second circumstance where you wouldn't want to use this because the door is static. But in the event that this door is moving, you're going to have to keep adjusting your masking area. That way, the arrow is getting hidden in the correct location. Okay, now there's little tricks that I kind of do and little cleanup efforts. Say this is the first frame where I want, say this is the first frame where I want masking to occur. I'm going to go ahead and set my mask expansion to 0. Okay, I'm going to go to the previous frame, and let's go ahead and move this whole thing over too so you can see the difference here. And on the previous frame here, okay, so this one I have it set to 0. On the previous frame where this is where no masking should be occurring, I like to set it to -500. This basically zeroes out the entire mask. This is so you don't have to worry about the masking coming into effect before it needs to. So until he gets to the doorway, let's just move it a little bit more. Until he gets to the doorway, that mask is not going to be used because it's at -500. So that's just a little cleanup effort I like to do in case you perhaps get to the very end, like say you're right here, and then for whatever reason you want to see the arrow in the next frame, well, your masking is still occurring. I mean, you could be on a different layer, you could be somewhere else, and you just don't realize it. So you might want to go ahead and set a -500 value where you want the mask to stop masking. Okay. Another little trick you can do is, this is a very, very sharp line here. And not every instance of masking is going to want to have such a sharp line. If you're using maybe a fabric or something that doesn't have a defined edge like this doorway, we can use the feathering. Okay, so let's go ahead and zoom in here. Down here you can see we have mask feather. So I put this on 10 pixels. That's a pretty large feather, right? Even 50. You can see it's starting to push all the way out over here. Problem is you get the feathering on the inside as well, so you want to keep that pretty small. So let's get really closer and see the difference. Okay, this is no feather, and then with 5, and then with 10. So it's basically just making it a bit softer of an edge for our mask. So you can use that to your advantage if you're trying to get a smoother effect for the masking, if it just doesn't quite look right because it's so sharp. So you can just see that the softness versus the sharpness there, which is probably a good technique in this video because it's so grainy that to have such a well-defined edge almost looks unnatural, because you can see if we zoom all the way in the door here, all these colors here are all mixing and it's not very sharp. So for our video we'd want, or for our arrow here, we might want to add a small feather. This way it just kind of blends in and it just makes sense in this situation. So that's pretty much all there is to masking. It's really simple. There's really not a whole lot to it. It just gets very cumbersome when you have a lot of masking area that you need to do. In this case I'm only using a square. If perhaps I wanted to say put a mask around her head, let's go ahead and just do a quick one for that. So Ctrl-Shift-N, I'm going to add a new mask, bring it down here. Okay, now we don't always have to deal with 4 points. That's just the default. Okay, so we have a few extra editing tools that we can use to our advantage. If we come up here to this little pen tool, if you hold left click on it, not just click it once but left click and hold, we'll get this little drop down here. Okay, this tool right here, add vertex tool, if we click on that, and if we click on the line, make sure you're on the line, not off of it, we can add additional vertexes. V is a shortcut to get back to your selection. So now I've got these extra vertexes where I can move them around. So I can get a little bit more definition now. So say I want to model around her head, I can hit G for the shortcut. I could add a few of these. Okay, let's go ahead and kind of get this in the general shape of her head. So you can get pretty specific with masking, and you can see that obviously the more detail you're adding, the better your results, but it also is going to take you more time, because now every frame I have to adjust a lot of masking to make this look good. Okay, so you can see we can add a bunch of vertexes there and get this into a much better shape. I also can convert vertex, and when I do that, let's go ahead and do it on the back of her head over here. This basically made it into where I've got these little handlebars, and this lets me move the vertex area around so that it can cause the masking to have a curved effect to it. And this is good for areas like this where someone's head or a round ball or anything like that, where these sharp angles just don't look natural, and so I can move this around and just make it look a little bit smoother. That way it just helps with our realism. So you can see we can get some really good tight masking in here when we've converted our vertex. Once again, not necessary, but always helps to add to the realism if that's what you're going for. Every little detail counts, and when you spend the time doing stuff like that, you generally get good results. So those are a few tools that you can use for masking there. Like I said, it's a pretty simple concept. It just can take a lot of work to make it look good, but honestly, in the end, it's a great payoff because it's almost necessary in some situations, such as this, where you need something to not be in the foreground because it just doesn't make sense. So that's all for masking. Let's go ahead and move on to the next section. Now I'd like to talk about adding text objects to a video. For this instance, I've got this scene here. Okay, I'm sure we've all seen this before, but he says, yes, that is awesome. So we're going to add the text on the screen, but we're also going to do it to where it only appears as he's saying it, because I think it gives a better profound expression than to just have the text sitting on the screen. If you actually have it as he's saying it, it tends to look a lot better. So let's go ahead and start by adding our text. So we're going to right click and say new text, and he says, yes, that is awesome. Okay, so the font I like to use for doing these is Arial with the mode set to black. Tend to get a good font that's very easily readable, and I also set it to all caps and faux bold. Alright, so the only adjustment we're going to have to make, let's go ahead and click in here, select all, is the sizing. So let's go with 60. Okay, it looks pretty good in relation to the video size. Click back on our arrow. Let's go ahead and move this to the center bottom. Okay, hide our controls for a second. Alright, that looks pretty good. So what we have to do now is we're going to expand this object, okay, the text object, and we're going to click animate, and we're going to choose opacity. Okay, so it's going to add this new animator. It's got this range selector in here. We're going to set the opacity to 0. Okay, so you shouldn't see anything at all. Now we come down here to range selector, and our big thing that we're going to be using here is the offset. And if we scrub with this, you can see what the offset does. It's basically a percentage of how much of the opacity is occurring from left to right. Okay, so starting at 0, let's go to where he says the first word, which is yes. Okay, so it's about right there. Alright, so on the previous frame, we're going to keyframe that. So we have 0% on the previous frame, then the one where we actually want him to say the word yes. Let's just slowly scrub this to... We want to go as far as we can up until you start seeing the next letter. See 26%, I can see that next T. Let's go 25, nope, 24, I still see it, 23. And the reason for this is because if you don't go far enough, you will start getting your letters are going to have the opacity applied to them, and so it's not going to look right. So you want to get this number as close as you can to where you don't see the next letter. So in this case it's 23%. Okay, so that's keyframed. We also want to make sure that we hold keyframes on this because we don't want it to do any type of tweening for the percentages, or else it'll slowly start showing up on the screen as we progress. Okay, so he says yes, and then that right about there. Oops. That. Okay, so let's do the next one. Slide this over about right here. 47 looks good. That is... Sometimes it's a little hard to read the text, or the speech for the text, but get as close as you can. Okay, and he says awesome. Let's move the is back a little bit, and then let's do 100% for the rest of it. Okay, so we didn't toggle hold correctly there. You can see if I don't toggle hold keyframe there, it's going to slowly start putting all that other percentages in there. You can see as I go through each frame, the percentage is going to try to figure out the difference between 23% and 47, so it's going to do the frames for that. You can see it changing on all these, so that's why we want to make sure that we do a toggle hold keyframe. Actually, we want to do that for all of these. Okay, so yes, that is awesome. There we go. So remember, all we do is hit animate, add our opacity object, set it to 0, and then start messing with the offset. Very simple, get some good results. The hardest part is going to be trying to read their lips to get the text properly set up. Okay, the last thing I like to go over with text objects is a small thing I like to do. I normally use white text. So I can click on this, hit F3, which will take me to my effects. Going down to stylize and glow. I'm going to set color A also down to black, so both these are black. And then the glow colors are going to use A and B. Now see, right now you can see it's glowing with a white color because it's using the original color, but when I switch it to A and B, we get this beautiful black glow. And here I can switch between the two. Okay, here's without it, and here's with it. It's a real subtle change, but adding a black background to white text increases the readability dramatically. And what you're trying to go for is a good creation here, and the best way to do it is to go ahead and add some glow to your text object. So that's how we do the talking text with a little bit added glow. Alright, let's go ahead and move on to the next section. I'd like to go over the 3D manipulation, and this is pretty useful in certain circumstances. Now you got to remember that a lot of times when we do our editing, we are working with 2D objects, unless you're able to work with 3D objects in After Effects, which is a little tricky to get into, but for right now we're sticking to 2D objects. So in this instance, I'm going to go to where he hits his hat off, and we're going to add an arrow on top of that hat and just basically make it flip over a few times as it's kind of coming towards the screen here. Okay, so let me go ahead and add my arrow. Okay, and let's dial down the size just a little bit. Okay, that's good enough. Alright, so let's just go ahead and do some quick position changes. So he hits it about right here. So don't forget that Control-Shift-H is so much better than staring at those controls. Like I said, I'm just going to do this really quick, so it's probably not going to look as good as it should. Okay, so we just want to have the arrow kind of flip over a few times after he hits it. So go down to your object. You'll see these 3 checkboxes here. You should be familiar with the first one, which is your motion blur. The third one, though, is 3D layer, and it says right there, this allows it to be manipulated in 3 dimensions. So let's go ahead and turn our controls back on so you can see what happens when I click this. We've now got our 3D axis that shows up over here, although I prefer just to use the rotation objects down here, the values. It's a little bit easier than trying to actually click on your X, Y, and Z up here. You can basically see it went from having a rotation option to when I enabled the 3D, I get X, Y, and Z rotation now. Z rotation was the previous rotation that we had, so if I move this around you can see it just basically spins in place. Okay. X rotation, on the X axis, it's going to spin. Now if you're having trouble seeing which way you're actually going, because like I said, we're in 2D space here, if you turn this back on, you can kind of see this is like it's laying on its back right now, because see how the blue is going up towards the sky? That normally is facing straight towards us. And then the same thing if I do the Y-axis. The blue is what's normally facing straight towards us. So if I turn this, it's basically turning over to its right side, and then this would be turning over to its left side. So this is some minor 3D manipulation. Like I said before, the problem with this though is that these are 2D objects, so if I spin this too much, well, what happens? It completely disappears because there's no thickness to it. It's just a 2D object. But if you make minor subtle changes, you can kind of create a certain effect to it. So let's have it actually come at us. So let's turn it on its side this way, and then let's see, by just turning on its side now, you can see it looks like it's kind of going down at an angle there. And of course, you don't want to set too much of a rotation because it's not going to look very realistic when you're dealing with a 2D object. So let's go ahead and just have it flip end over end in this case. So let's start with X, and let's go to the end, and let's say 180. So that's going to do one flip. Okay, so that's not very much. Let's go ahead and do 2.5 flips. Maybe a little too much. Just go 2 complete flips. So you can see it's flipping end over end on itself, which is cool if you do it non-excessively. You don't want to get ahead of yourself with the 3D, because with 2D objects you can easily kind of put yourself in a bad position because it won't look correct. But you know, if you kind of play around with it a little bit, you can kind of get some good results in there to make it add a little bit more realism to it. So that's about it for the 3D manipulation. It's not a whole lot you can do since we have 2D objects here. Let's go look at one other example where this becomes useful. And this is a nice little thing I've worked with before. So I got a billboard and I've got some footage of Mario Kart. Okay, so we're going to put this Mario Kart footage onto the billboard. That way it just looks like it's playing on the billboard. So I've added my render object here, and this is also another neat little trick, is that you can put GIFs on top of other GIFs. We can just layer these things on top of each other as many times as you want. You might have to end up tweaking a few speed options, which I'm not going to go over right now, but this is a great trick to be able to do this. Now it's obviously a little bit big here, so I'm going to scale this down. Now if you don't want to use the scaling and you want to use the controls on the side here to do it, a little trick you can do is you can click on it. After you've clicked, press shift, and then you can move this, and it'll basically lock it so that it keeps its proportion, its aspect ratio. If you hold shift beforehand and click it, it deselects it. I don't really know why they did it that way, but that's how you got to do it. So let's go ahead and make this just a little bit smaller. Okay. Enable our 3D manipulation. Turn it on its side a little bit. Angle that up. Maybe a little more scaling. Okay, I'm not going to spend all day on this, but that's good enough. Okay, so I just did a little minor tweaks, 12 and 21%, but now it kind of puts this video like it's essentially playing on this billboard because it's sitting at an angle. So you can get quite creative if you just make some minor subtle tweaks. I mean, we took a video that was flat and we put it on its side, and we're able to put it on a billboard here. So just imagine some other things you could do just by playing with the XYZ rotation. If you had a billboard that was at a much greater angle, you can see I can turn this really far if I wanted to. I can flip it upside down. I can do basically whatever I want with it. If you maybe have perhaps somebody's on a computer screen and you want to make it look like they're doing something on a computer but they're looking from the side, well, I can go ahead and just kind of angle this over here. So now if the person is sitting on the left side looking at a computer on the right, you can make it look like they're playing Mario Kart with just some minor 3D manipulation. So very powerful tool. Not necessarily useful in all cases, but definitely has some good areas for doing some editing. I hope these tools and ideas are useful to you, and thank you for watching.